Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. My name is Benjamin Ward. I am a product manager on the Lightroom team. And that is all enough about me because the star of the show today is Cyn Lagos, an absolutely fantastic photographer who is here with us today to share some of her work and her technique with us. Today, Cyn is going to be talking specifically about editing for print. I know for me, I'm really excited to see this and learn about this because almost all of what I do is, of course, for sharing online. And when I do print, I send a file off to a print service with my fingers crossed, and that's what I do. So I'm really excited for this one and really looking forward to learning all about this. Cyn, before we get started, I'll turn it over to you in just a moment, but I just want to say hi to a few people who are joining us here. If you see me looking like this down towards my left, I have another screen down here where I have the chat going. So I'm not ignoring Cyn if I'm looking down here. I'm looking to see what folks are chatting about. If you've joined us in the live stream on YouTube, awesome. Thank you for joining us. But you might want to consider switching over to the live stream at behance.net because if you are on Behance, you can chat with us live during the live stream here. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. And I will relay your questions to Cyn so that she can answer those. And I do see some folks joining us. Hi, Sean. Hi, Stefan. Hi, Andreas. Noor. Awesome. Thank you guys for being here. Really looking forward to hearing about this. One other thing before I turn it over to Cyn for the good stuff. We have, let's see here. Let me just check what I've got here. If you missed the last Photoshop Daily Creative Challenge, you can watch the replays every weekday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Don't miss it tomorrow. And let's see, this afternoon, let's see, well, it's not, I shouldn't say things like this afternoon because my time isn't necessarily your time. But after this, you can stick around for UI UX design with Andrea Marquez, which starts at 12 p.m. Pacific. All right, Cyn, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cyn Lagos. I'm a street photographer and graphic designer. At the moment, I am based in Austin. I am really happy to be here. This is honestly one of my favorite things to do is to be able to teach aspiring artists such as yourselves. And today we're going to be covering a topic that is very dear to me because I have a background in graphic design. And as such, I've always been very inspired by the print medium. And now that I'm a photographer, I thought, you know, I've done quite a lot of things, but never really explored enough of seeing my work in real life, right? Like seeing my work tangible. And I think a lot of you can relate to that. Today, we share everything online. So today we're going to explore how we edit our images with print in mind. And the workflow changes quite a bit, not too much, but you'll have a good tidbits that are gonna be very helpful for your print process. So before we start there, I'm gonna talk a little bit about my background and fill you in on sort of how I ended up here. I think this is just in general, such a interesting journey that we all take. And so let me just switch to the presentation really fast. Let me know if you can see that. Should say footprint on your screen at the moment.
I can see that. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. So my work revolves around street photography, and over my journey, I honestly have been focusing more on storytelling. And I think a lot of you can relate to that because storytelling can change. I mean, the subject matter can change really quickly. So I find myself photographing the streets, but also doing portraiture or architecture. A lot of these elements for me express the nuances of the cultures of the spaces that I photograph. And I think that in itself is a valuable story to tell. So along this journey, I've always found myself experimenting with different mediums. This is why we're here today, right? I'm experimenting with print today. And What I mean by that is a lot of us probably pick up our first cameras, our phones. And for me, it was actually phone photography. And it was really fun because there was a lot less pressure on trying to figure out all of those buttons and what they're supposed to do. Down the road, I finally picked up a DSLR and have found myself in this really beautiful space of having control over everything I get to photograph. But the medium continues to change. I mean, I find myself experimenting with immersive photography. So that's 360 videography slash photography. And so like, I think that has taught me a huge lesson on how the medium can constantly change, but you can remain focused on the story. So that's going to be relevant because in excuse me, when we edit, we're always going to keep in mind how to nurture the story that we're trying to tell within the photograph, while also keeping in mind where our photograph is going to be shared and experienced, right? So those are two separate mediums that I think are very important while you're editing and going through your process. It's not necessarily always about just oversaturating or scaling something bigger because it'll be better. Sometimes it's about focusing on that story and also focusing on where that story will be experienced. So I want to share with you something that happened during last year, our madness that happened last year, right? It was a wild ride for sure. And that honestly allowed a lot of space for me to take on projects and ideas that I had probably left on the back burner, and maybe they weren't priority at the time, right? So print was one of those things. I've always wanted to set up a print shop of my own. I've always wanted to see my work in real life. And I remember the first time that I saw my first print, it was actually a workshop with Canon at the time. They were giving away prints and, so long as you provided your image. And I remember when my print was ready, I picked it up and it felt like it was my birthday. I was just so excited to see this photo that I had seen quite a bit via my screen. I had posted it. It was all very surreal to see these details. And at first I attributed all of it to the printer. And then I realized that, it was a journey for it to get there, because first I photographed it, but also the person who printed the photo had to keep in mind how to honor the colors that I had applied to that image so that it can translate over to that print medium. And that's really, really important to keep in mind, because what we see on the screen, and that's the tricky part with print, what we see on the screen is not what translates over on print immediately. We have to do a few tweaks here and there to be able to compensate for this screen that we have in front of us. So through a lot of trial and error and experimenting, I found myself creating an entire brand for a print shop that I was going to set up online. So instead of binging on movies, which I absolutely definitely did in the very first half of that crazy madness, I definitely found myself a little bit more productive and more excited about creating things that I had always wanted to do, but nobody was demanding me to do it. You probably can understand that, because I think we all have just ideas all over the place, right? I have an entire notebook filled with ideas. So I started creating the brand, and I had a Canon printer at home. This is a medium format printer. So it's not the big gigantic printers, but it is a qualified printer for fine art prints. And it's a Pixma 100 Canon. What's really wonderful about it is that it has an array of different colors and hues and tones of the same of the ink, right? So tones of the same hue. So it's really wonderful because it's going to be really accurate with the way the color is delivered onto the paper. but we have to communicate with that printer. And it doesn't really matter what printer do you have. In reality, this workflow will apply to any printer. I know this because I've experimented with laser printers, I've experimented with inkjet printers, and finally I was able to invest in a fine art printer. And I knew that I wanted to do that because I wanted to do the entrepreneur, had that intern energy to do the shop on my site. So I did, and I called it Market Visual Marketplace. I'm going to share that with you just now so you can get an idea of how that developed. So Visual Marketplace at first started with my first print after a lot of trial and error. At first it was this bottom image right here. I printed this image and the color of the sky came out sort of green and very, very opaque. And that was something that I had to really recognize during the editing process that I hadn't, because I had edited this image for online platforms. So I was editing this image so that it can be a standout, dramatic, saturated image, so that when you're scrolling, it's going to be like this wonderful showstopper, right? And I think a lot of us have that workflow at the moment. You can still pick up some of those images that you've edited. You just have to compensate for some things like that we'll talk about in just a minute, actually. So I had a lot of different practice. Even with each image, it was absolutely a brand new experience. For this image with the hand and the rainbow, when I first printed it, the colors didn't come out. The shadows were very dark. Not only did I waste a lot of black ink, which, as you can imagine, was overhead for me as a business owner, but it was also sort of disappointing to not see the rainbow color palette. And I know that if someone's going to buy this image, it's because of that beautiful rainbow color that I had found serendipitously on the wall. So I needed to do a lot of trial and error for that one as well. And then when it came to the architecture, that was something really special because I was able to see a lot of the details, something that I hadn't been able to see with all the other images, because this was a photograph I took in a Sony camera. Sony is very wonderful at taking very detailed shots, sometimes at kind of the dismay of a model, because the skin is not meant to be super detailed, but when it comes to architecture, it's absolutely wonderful. So when I got this one right, I was just enamored, honestly. I still have it actually on my wall at home. I haven't been able to disconnect from that one, but I do have these prints available, and I print them on demand, but I also have this kind of sense of ease knowing that I can get the color right over and over because I did these test trials. So let's talk a little bit about how to have print in mind. And if you have any questions at this point, please share them on the comment. I know that this is something that a lot of people pursue. It has been a very interesting experience to set up a shop on my website that is an animal of its own. But I think just maintaining the purity and the consistency of the print was one of the most precious part that I wanted to make sure to get right above all, so that I am delivering an image that is obviously important to me, and is obviously an image that the person who purchases hopes to get, right? When they see it on a screen, they hope to get the same color palette. So I want to talk about.
There are a couple questions. Is it okay if I interject with these?
Yes, of course.
So first, I have to share that there was a whole humorous conversation and series of comments from some folks in the chat.
Okay.
That a number of us, and I put myself in this group as well, are much too old for our first camera to have been a telephone. And
Okay.
then there was a great conversation that the people were having a chat about what was your first camera. So that was really cool. Thanks, everybody.
Ooh.
There are two questions that have come in. Oh, there are three questions that have come in. The first from Noor is a little bit off topic, maybe, but I think is a good question. And wondering if you just do digital photography or if you also shoot film, and if you have any recommendations around that.
I don't shoot film. It is a situation that like I think every it's just really funny because every single time I tell someone that I haven't gone to film, it just added to the list of things I want to be able to embark on. So for me, photography was a self-taught experience through the World Wide Web. One of the reasons why this here is so special to me is that for a very long time I was paying attention to the mentors and people that are online that share all of their ideas and tips, and that's how I learned photography. Also by practice, right? Like showing up and photographing every single day, no matter what it was, right? Most times I went outside, I didn't know what I was photographing. So I haven't jumped into the film part of it. So I'm sort of like going through the academy of Cyn Lagos in a way. So it's up to me to take on that space and say, I want to learn from it. I do want to learn from it because I understand that the Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom are actually mimicked after the experience of the darkroom and the lab, right? When you're dodging and burning, that's that same experience. And it's such a cool historical reference to like be able to kind of put the dots together and understand. So if you do film and don't do digital, then definitely jump into both because they're different, but they have these special connections right along the way. I will eventually venture into that area too.
Awesome, thank you. There were a couple other questions. One question from Sean, which just scrolled off my screen. Where'd it go? There it is. Asking if you about printing on alternate materials, asking about metal in particular, but do you print on any unusual materials?
At the moment, I'm not printing on unusual materials because it is such an incredible machine that I have going on here. So you can't just put any substrate through this printer. When I had an inkjet printer that I was okay with basically destroying, I put through it a cloth, and I made an entire like annual report for, at the time it was Urban Outfitters, for like just as an experiment to be able to just print a magazine on cloth. And the concept behind that was that Urban Outfitters biggest revenue that year was their clothing and not their novelty items. So I kind of ran with that concept and experiment on my laser printer. So do experiments, but just keep in mind that the machine itself might give way eventually. So if it's a very expensive machine, I would be very careful. I am very careful. But it is a really cool experience to just sort of put anything through there and see what comes out.
Hey, okay, I love that idea of the cloth, printing on the cloth. There are a couple other questions that have come in here. One from Monica, one from, sorry, I'm scrolling through my list here, Maria. I'm gonna relay them both to you now because I have a feeling that they might be things that you're planning to address upcoming. And I don't want to keep you from your presentation, but Monica asks if you have a preferred paper for your prints. And Maria asks, is it better to have your own printer as a small business? Is it better to have your own printer, or is it better to outsource printing to a print shop?
And those are questions I definitely asked myself. That was because as a small shop owner, it's one of those things where you have to think, oh wow, like this is becoming like a lot of overhead. Is it worth it enough that I don't have to charge too much? And you start just doing the numbers, right? So It depends. If you're running a lot of prints and you're also in the space of just passion prints, it is really cool to print at home. Having these prints homemade was such a special experience for me because I was stuck at home. So being able to make them my own, I like found ways to make them collectibles. It is really, really cool to just have an idea and spark, and then suddenly seconds later you're printing it. So I would encourage having your own printer, although I know it's a lot to invest on. Maybe start with printers that, because every printer out there, especially inkjet printers, can give you some kind of output depending on your settings. So there's way to really push the boundaries. The difference between my printer is that I'm able to print a bigger scale, and I also can trust that this ink will not die out once exposed to light. It actually has 100 years of guarantee, which is nuts. You know, that's what makes it, what defines it as a fine art print. It's not going to fade away along the years, right? And I think depending on what kind of photography you do, I think and your purpose and where you hope to share this photo, that will determine what kind of, whether you print at home or outsource. Now, when it comes to outsourcing, I've done that too, especially for prints that I cannot make at home. Anything 24 by 36. I actually did that for a project. Another reason that I find prints very special is having the opportunity to exhibit your work in ways that are more organic. So one of the things that I wanted to do in my hometown in Miami, Florida, I went to one of the neighborhoods that I really love because I grew up there, Wingwood, and it's just such a special place. It's full of artists. And I decided to print these like 24 by 36 prints. The quality wasn't as important in this situation because I was going to add glue to them and I was going to just like splatter them. Like the distress was actually part of the fun. And I put them up on the walls, and that was just a cool way of being able to see how people interacted with it, but also how the neighborhood itself was able to kind of stand as a studio, or, you know, as an outdoor studio for me to showcase my work. Excuse me. So I saw it fitting because my work is street, and that just adds up to where I hope my photography is experienced. And so it depends. Quality isn't everything. If you are going to showcase your work in a medium like this, or maybe if you have it at a large scale, like if you think about it, billboards print at the lowest resolution because you'll never see a billboard a few feet away. So you're not really staring at that minute detail. So you have a lot of freedom to really like sort of stretch those pixels. So I would ask myself, where is this print going to go? And if this print is going to go somewhere where someone's going to meticulously stare at it, because it's a indoor art exhibition, or because it's going to hang in their home, and you hope that they appreciate it as such, then that will kind of dictate your decisions thereafter. Yeah, so let's jump a little bit into the way I like to approach my workflow, and more importantly, modify my workflow from my regular editing process for social media platforms or sharing my photographs on my online portfolio to sharing them on print. So one thing that I have to keep in mind always, because I am editing on a monitor that is not necessarily calibrated for my printer, that is like an entire other game that print shops take on. So that's one of the wonderful perks of sending your prints out, is that they have these calibrated monitors specifically for their printers. And so they're able to see the true color on their screens that they would print. We may not have that. Most of us have the computers that we use for many other things. So in order to compensate for this, I always work with my printer brightness at somewhere around 4%, 3%, sometimes 8% depending on the kind of photo, if it's a nighttime shot. The reason for this is that you're going to actually compensate for the lack of brightness. We have to think about the monitor being a backlit screen, and the print is basically, there's nothing lighting up that print whatsoever. So we're going to have to make it a little bit brighter. We're going to err on the brighter side for most things. Even the shadows are going to play out a little bit lighter when it comes to the editing process. So saturation, as I mentioned before, was a big trial basis, because realizing that I would print something that wouldn't have the equivalent saturation, and it doesn't have to be saturation, it could be vibrance, whatever gives more of that color, and it tells the printer, hey, add more of this cyan. Cyan sometimes for me was always very low on the final print, or the yellows tend to be very low. Very common. Also, that's one of the inks that runs out the fastest. It's the one that I keep like having to turn around the most. So compensate for those colors by saturating them a little bit more. And we'll do that in our prints. You'll see that what you see on the image is a little bit too much. You wouldn't share that on social media necessarily, because you'll see that it's like too processed, but it will be the right processing for the print. The last thing, and it's very important, is the shadows. The shadows sometimes, the reason why you have to compensate for the shadows and make them brighter and almost make them look a little bit foggy in a sense. I'll explain that in the dialog box in Lightroom in a bit. The reason why we have to do that is that once you print, there is no zooming in, there's no zooming out, nothing. So the shadows are the first place where you can lose a lot of the detail and information. So by increasing those shadows and bringing them up a little bit, you're going to be able to allow the printer to, draw those textures or those details that you had within that image that maybe you saw on the monitor, but you're not going to be able to see on the actual print if you don't compensate and dial it up. A big question that I get a lot is, and I was very kind of confused about this, because I have over 8 years of graphic design experience, and it's just nuts to me how many times I've delivered, basically magazines or any print communications that had to be in CMYK. It was like, sort of burned into my brain, like it has to be CMYK. So when it came to printing at home, I was very surprised to learn that between RGB and CMYK, I actually have to print in RGB. And it's a common misconception, because RGB is meant for the screen, basically. That's the gamut that most screens or visible screens, like your phone, run in, right? CMYK is a division of all those colors in ink form in an offset printer. But we don't have an offset printer. We're doing this at home. And the technology for these inkjet printers are actually to deliver the colors at once, not in separations like an offset printer would. And maybe you haven't stepped into a large offset printer, but they have just an entire facilities compartmentalized for just cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And we're not doing this at home. We're going to have our work specifically in RGB, so that our printer reads that gamut, that range of colors. And so very, very important, because otherwise your colors are going to come out really strange. You'll get purples where there's blue, and it's kind of fun, actually. If you want to not, I don't know, there's almost like this editing process that happens if you switched some settings around, and I've gotten some really cool colors and gone back to the editing and said, like, you know what, I'm going to play with this and make it a little surreal. So it all depends. It's really all very fun and an experimenting process.
Cyn, there is a question from General Kenobi. The Jedi are with us here today.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Nice.
Right?
That's a good sign.
I think you actually answered this on your own since the question was posted. But I just want to make sure. It sounds like the question is about monitor calibration, and do you calibrate your monitor? It sounds like you answered that no. In that case, was it just a process of experimentation to get your prints looking right, or how did that work?
Yeah. So I don't calibrate my monitor because I use it for a lot of other things. So it would be a deterrence to like a lot of the rest of my work. Instead, I compensate during my editing process, and that really helps me and allows me to just keep the colors true, keep the brightness true. Being able to bring down the brightness and editing in that way helps me also. So instead of calibrating it, because that would change all the hues in my screen altogether. So that's an easy, I guess, like a cheat sheet to not having to do that, because that was very intimidating for me at first. And once I tried doing that, I was like, okay, well, this is going to be a headache for everything else I've got to do on my computer. So I found that this workflow was an easier way to accomplish that.
Awesome. And then couple questions, both Monica and Boris have asked about paper. Do you have a paper that you prefer? How did you decide on a paper? Did you experiment with different papers and so on?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I do experiment with papers. There are some papers that are specifically made so that they work with the ink technology of this printer. So there is different textures and substrates. And some of my favorites are, depending on what kind of image you're printing, I love printing on matte paper. Matte paper just has such a degree of elegance on it. In fact, like when I go to do an interview and I'm going to print my work, I tend to print it on a matte paper just to give that ooze of like, wow, I feel like I'm sort of going through a fashion catalog. And there is no color. A matte paper does not reflect any light. So the blacks tend to sit there so beautifully. It almost looks like a masterpiece. It's also really wonderful for printing illustrations. Matte papers actually highlight more of those, like that vector format. Like it actually brings out those colors in a way where it looks like somebody actually manually drew them. So if you're into illustrations or a combination of mediums, which I often do with my photography, then I think that could be a good route. Another paper that I really like is canvas paper, because not the actual canvas, but like texture or watercolor paper. Because I mostly love using that for anything that has to do with nature, because the tactility will give that extra textures to the leaves or the landscape itself. And I think that's a cool, like, extra bit of detail that you add in just the substrate, like extra bit of information. So it depends on what you're printing, I would say. And experimenting with like which inks fit best with the papers, also kind of marrying them together is another part of processing which paper you're going to use. Okay, so the last question before we jump into editing. What DPI do I use? Sometimes, I've realized that we often think, okay, well, it must be 300 DPI. Everything has to be 300 DPI. Like, we can't make it 299. That would be terrible. And what I realized is that there's give depending on what you're doing. All of that is a decision based on where you're going to share your photographs. So it's a question of making it bigger or making it detailed. So the smaller your image, depending on where you photographed it or what the output of your cameras are. If it's a phone photography, I've had the experience of like, I mean, the phones have changed a lot. The first print I did out of a phone can only print like a tiny 4x6, and it was like kind of sad because I couldn't stretch it any further. Now they're able to go as like 14 by 11 by 14, so like legal size paper. You can start to stretch that further if you decide to let go of that dots per inch, right? Because the dots per inch is that detail. So you could make it 180 and it will get bigger, right? But it will show more of that detail. So that's when maybe that question about what paper do I use comes into play. Because if I was to know that the detail is going to show, it's going to be, the pixels are going to show a lot more, maybe hide them away by using a textured paper. I've printed my images on a canvas, a wrapped up canvas in the past through an outsourced printer. And I did those specifically because I had stretched those phone images to a larger size. So I knew that the pixels were going to show, but on a canvas, you can't tell the difference. And that was the wonderful part of experimenting and considering both ends.
Cyn, can I just like put in an on-topic yet shameless plug? In Adobe Camera Raw a few days ago, in the latest release of Adobe Camera Raw, there's a new feature called Super Resolution that will use artificial intelligence to quadruple the resolution of your files. It works amazingly well. And one of the great applications for this is revisiting older photos that we had that were maybe from lower resolution cameras that we couldn't really print or print as large as we want. So you can go back and check out some kind of older things, and you might find that you can actually use this new super resolution feature to blow them up a bit. That'll be coming to Lightroom and Lightroom Classic in the near future.
Oh, that's good to know, because I have, yeah, I mean, it's interesting how much, I mean, Adobe Sensei can just like decipher on its own. At some point you just think like, wow, he's like my coworker in a way. But like that part has always been very difficult for me, because having these wonderful images that, you know, you can't retake because they were from a time and place, and having that like internal regret of like, wow, I didn't have the right camera then. And of course I can't print this bigger. I guess it's a common like qualm for a lot of people. So I'm glad to hear there's some innovation there. So let's jump into the editing lab. And if you have any more questions, share them along on the comment section. We'll continue to answer some more as we edit. And feel welcome to bring on your own image and experiment, or fire up Lightroom and follow along this tutorial. You'll see that experience of where your images start to look slightly different from where you expect. And I think that's like just an important part of understanding the changes in workflow for online versus print. All right, so I've gone ahead and imported my images. I have them cataloged here. One of my favorite things about Lightroom Classic, and I think a lot of us, at least a lot of my friends, are still like diehards Lightroom Classic. And I really love it, mostly because of the organization and the way I'm able to keep all of my presets organized here and available for use in the future. I love experimenting with editing. I think it's one of my favorite parts of the workflow process. Aside from going out and photographing, I think this is my second favorite part. So this image here, I brought in a couple images because I want to show different examples of particular scenarios that I keep running into. So I want to talk a little bit about how I like to select some of my images. Um, this image I know is going to be a bit of a challenge because we have shadows, we have those shadows and that saturation that we just talked about. So right away, I'm going to first, I want to crop this because I think that the composition I was going after was actually the silhouettes. And by the way, in this cropping section, I always like pressing the letter O and trying to find the different compositions that I can experiment. And I don't know if this is just something that it was sort of hidden for me. And then one day I thought, wow, this is wonderful. Because composition is probably the biggest part of what makes most of my photographs really, really strong. Just having that experimentation. And so I like using this one. It's a bit like a golden ratio. It is in fact based on the golden ratio. If it's a bit advanced, I guess, if you think about it, but just consider it like the rule of thirds. Just follow along where the lines are and try to place the subjects of interest in that space. And what's great about this is that now we're not cropping for a 4:5 or 16:9 social media like space, right? We're cropping for the size of our image. So I always tend to have my size somewhere along 5:7 or 4:5s, but that's just what I like to print. I don't always print edge to edge. I often like to cut my photographs because I like experimenting with the cropping heights, especially when it has to do with an image like this, because it benefits from a height that is a little bit unorthodox. It's not common ground in photography to have a 16:9, in this case 9:16, the other way around. But I like experimenting. You know, all the rules are there for us to bend them and reshape them and create some of our own. So this is something that I approach in that way too. So let me move this around. Okay, there you go. Okay, so right away, I'm going to start on my basics dialog here. Let me just organize this. Okay, there you go. So this color, what's great about this, I've already gone ahead and like decreased the brightness. And this is important all the time. I'm not going to decrease it too much right now, but I just want you to know that usually I have it all the way down. But I'm gonna just kind of keep it here for now because I'm using it. But so what's important is to always be on the side of brighter is better. So at the moment I have this this bit of clipping happening, and that's tricky because since we're trying to make our image brighter, sometimes our eye can't detect where we are actually clipping that information and we've gone too far. So I always like to keep the letter J on. So I hit the hotkey J so that I can see if like I'm overdoing it, right? So all of that information is going to be lost if I dial it up way too much. So we want to be able to bring it up because then that's going to help the printer, but we don't want to lose that information in our file. I'm also a very big fan of approaching everything on an individual basis. So approaching the highlights separately, the whites separately, and not necessarily doing a universal edit like exposure on the entire image, because that basically applies to everything. And at the moment, I don't want to mess with my shadows. So I instead go and approach everything individual. So I'll approach it from the highlights, I'll approach it from the whites. So when it comes to my contrast, I'm going to bring that down because I want to, although I love the drama of the shadows, I actually want those shadows to have information left in them. So I'm going to bring that down. I'm also going to bring down the blacks a little, we'll dial up the blacks a little bit. And you can see there, if I did the opposite, that blue is showing me where I'm losing all of that information as well. So very helpful to keep that visual cue there.
Cyn, do you do a different edit for your photo? For example, the prints that you sell and that you list on your website, do you do a different edit for the photo for where it's going to be displayed on your website versus the edit you do for what the file you'll actually be printing? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense because sometimes the image that I choose to print, I have already edited for my website. So I actually have to sort of retouch it because it's really not a whole lot. It's really focusing on those the brightness, the saturation, and the shadows, and honoring some of the colors. So compensating for those blue greens are going to come out as like super teal and maybe too extreme. So compensating for that, adding more blue to them. It's more like I retouch an image that was already edited. In this case, I'm starting from raw just to give you a sense of like how I would approach this, but you can do it to an image that has already been edited so long as you see it from that viewpoint. And so we're going to jump into the curves here because it's also like such a great way to have a lot of control over your highlights, your midtones, and your shadows, right? So we're getting a bit artistic here where I'm kind of creating this purple color for my shadows. So they're not necessarily just a plain black. And at this point, it's sort of up to you. What is your style? I love to create a lot of drama and contrast. So I want to still have that ability, but I know that what I'm looking at right now may look a lot brighter, but once it outputs, it would actually look darker. So it will have that contrast. So I'm keeping in the back of my mind that this will actually have the contrast that I want. But I do like painting the shadows a different color because it just gives it that artistic element. It also gives it a bit of an homage to film and all of the delicacies of different films that would output a different color. It's sort of like a mistake, but it actually is something that you can reference and apply to your color, to your editing process today, digitally. So I like the way that looks. This one's a fairly simple one. Mostly, I make sure that everything is brighter, and I think that's like probably the biggest key that I hope you take away from this is compensate for the brightness, for the saturation, and for those shadows so that you don't lose that information, because it will really show in your final print. If it's not bright enough, you'll just see a very dull print that doesn't have those really rich colors and those really rich contrasts. So we're going to edit this more complex image that I took in New York with my friend. And it was really kind of interesting because at that moment, we had found this spot where the buildings were sort of covering a certain area. She stood right on the sun. So that shadow play was really nice. And I want to be able to bring that out. So again, I'm going to crop this image, but I'm also going to use this ruler here on the side. I like using it to be able to line my horizon. And I think that's, again, another rule that can be broken. But in this case, I want to be able to align my horizon quite exact. And so I find that this is very helpful to do that. You can also hold shift to be able to keep that straight, or you can just do it manually and find an area that is aligned to the horizon. Okay, and again, that's in the cropping section, just in case you missed that. Okay, so in this one, I'm going to increase the temperatures. I noticed that a lot of my colors tend to come out a lot more on the colder side. So I'll bring in the temperature a little bit so that when it comes out is a little bit warmer. I know, again, we're going to be viewing an image that is going to appear more processed, but the print is going to dial it down. Okay, so again, we're gonna go and focus on our highlights and hit that J to make sure that we're not clipping anything. And we can push this one actually pretty far out. So that's really good. And bring up the whites, not too much. And now with the shadows, if I actually want these, there's not a lot of information there. Sometimes the shadows sit on parts of like nature or buildings that you actually want to show. So those are the areas that, or if somebody's face, that's really important. You don't want to print something where the face is just absolutely a black ink and not nuances of that face structure. So those are kind of the spaces that probably, I think being very careful with your shadows is most important. So we're going to increase those shadows a bit without clipping too much. There you go. And the one thing I like to do is play with the calibration. I use this very liberally. I love being able to sort of manipulate the different colors that it gives me, right? Here I'm able to tune in into the blues and that cinematic color palette that we often see in movies where it's that beautiful teal and red. I love being able to reinterpret that because as street photographs, I think what's really cool is bringing in your artistic viewpoint, right? It is sort of like journalism, but it borders on artistic. And so I like to be able to re-emphasize that with some of those references, like being able to add color to my shadows because of film cameras, or being able to do teals and red combinations because, or purples, it all depends, because of the movies that I have often seen that have that same color palette. And because of that, I mean, our culture has that same reference, and they will associate these editings with the same thing. So I like playing around with that here. I think that gives me, you can see there that extreme change in the hue. So like if you see here, actually, I'll show you one of my favorite shortcuts. I tend to use the backward slash to be able to see my previews, or the letter Y to be able to see what I've done and how far I've taken the image. All right. Again, that's the Y. I use this quite often because sometimes, you're there playing for hours and all of a sudden you think, oh man, I overdid it. And so whenever you have overdone it, I tend to just like double click the dials. So it resets to 0. You can also put 0 there, but it's just in terms of like doing things fast. I double click it, or I hit reset, and reset is for all of the settings. So be careful with the reset, but otherwise double clicking, I think like that's the trick. So I'm going to push those colors a little bit, and I like how that looks. And again, it's going to be dialed down. I can't stress that enough because it's something that the outcome isn't necessarily reflected here. but we are oversaturating in this case. We're doing all the things that they tell us not to do, oversaturating, making it brighter. And, you know, that is going to help a lot in the process.
I'll throw in a quick tip as well. If you hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on Windows, you can reset a whole panel at once. So not the whole image and not an individual slider, but like a panel in that.
Oh, cool. Nice. Yeah, because that's the thing that happens, I think, that after you spend so much time on Lightroom, you start to really recognize how these hotkeys become like just like a very quick workflow. And I highly depend on them because I think they're just like, one, they make the process very fun because it's just very quick. But two, it's also just a way to not have to navigate to each individual space and just have it sort of as a second nature. So when it comes to this image, I really love this image. Actually, I'd love to share that one with you in a little bit. But this image was taken during a summer in New York. And I had actually taken the same photograph during the winter, and the light conditions were a lot different. And so I was lucky enough to be able to be here while that ship was kind of crossing in the center. And I thought that was really peculiar and special composition to be able to capture. That's the tricky part with architecture, right? Like you can't really tell it to move. You can't really tell it to do anything. You just sort of have to wait or show up at a different time and try to photograph it in a different mood and a different space. So that's what I did on this one. And having this image taken during bright light, it was, I think, at least 2:00, allowed for a lot of the colors to be captured by my camera. And so this raw file can really be pushed to a pretty far extreme. So I'm gonna bring up the blacks and you can see how much information was hidden under there, which is kind of wild, especially when it comes to these types of images, because being able to see the structure and the detail of the structure is part of what you're going to be sort of oozing over when you have the print hanging on your wall, right? So we don't want to lose that in the final print process. So I'm going to bring up those shadows there, and then also bring up some of those highlights. You can see there I was starting to clip. This area clips because there's almost like this really stylistic glare that showed up, but I think I'm fine with that. I'm not losing information that is absolutely vital. So I'm going to leave it that way. And what's really fun about experiencing this image in print is observing, having that voyeurism, right, that is so innate to photography, and being able to see a moment in time when that's frozen and these folks were there observing this beautiful view from this colossal building or structure, I guess, because it's not necessarily like a functional building. It's more of an art piece. So that already brings out a lot of the colors and brings out a lot of the information. I do want to go and play with the blues, and you can do that in different areas. I sometimes do it in tone curves where I select the blue hue. And it's really cool now that the most recent update, it really shows you where you're pulling the line towards the green or the blue hue. Before it didn't have that. And I think that's very helpful. Or sometimes I go into my HSL section and I'm able to target that specific color and even target a color, a hue of that color. So you have this one here that starts to show me that particular blue on the image. And then you have this one will show me a different type of blue. You can see what a different change that is, right? Sometimes I've printed, one of my first times printing this image, it sort of showed up this way. And so I had to compensate by giving it more navy blue so that it would come out this way. And that's just that experimentation. I will show you how I go about printing sort of a test sheet to be able to see which works best. It is a trial and error, and it is like a super, I guess, specific process, but it's going to be worth it, because at the end, being able to get that accurate color, and then knowing that you have a preset and a profile set for that color and that image is going to make the process moving forward a lot easier. So I'm going to make this, because I want it to come out teal, I'm going to add more of that navy blue and more of that green on this side. And we're going to increase the saturation a bit. Luminance doesn't do quite much, but I love playing with the luminance, because sometimes it just makes it look out of this world. So if I want my brightness to print around here, then I compensate by dialing it up a little bit. And that will show up here on my print. And so the same, if I want it to be somewhere here, then I'll dial it up just a few numbers up. And I'm just going to give some saturation to that orange so that it really shows, and it does that contrast of warmth and cool colors.
Cyn, do you ever use the soft proofing feature in Lightroom Classic?
I have in the past. I don't really use it for this workflow. Do you want to share with us how you use it?
I was just curious if you'd found it worked for you or didn't work for you, or what. But
yeah, it wasn't really that helpful for me, and because I've found a different way of doing it. But yeah, I guess it could be useful. So you can see here, we can hit the Y, and you can see that the change in the editing, right? And we're going to bring up, because I really do want to see these little, basically they're going to show up very tiny, but the figures themselves can get, once the ink lands on the paper, it just spreads, right? It can actually just make the pixels look a little bit softer than they are. So in order to compensate for that, we're going to make the image a bit sharper. So we're going to go up here to basics again and go and increase that clarity. And don't worry so much about grain. Depending on the kind of paper that you're using, it will actually soften up, because we are compensating for that ink drop. But it is something that you might have to consider if you're printing in something glossy, because I've noticed that it does show, especially on the shadows. So that's a bit tricky. That's something you have to think about when you're thinking about your paper.
Alberto says, awesome shot. I agree with that. I agree with Alberto. And there was a question from Boris about how you mentioned that you do like a test print. Do you print the full image, or do you print a specific part of the image, or what's your test printing process like?
Sure. If you give me a moment, I'll show you. So
Tension's killing me.
So I have two different sheets here that I experimented with, and in this case, the prints are done on this paper that is a luster paper. So I'll just show it to you here. So this is a luster paper that I don't know if you can see it on the screen at the moment. Okay, gotcha. All right, let's work this out. All right. Does that work?
Hey.
Boom. Okay. All right.
There we go. Yep.
We're working
There we
this
go.
out. Okay.
I can see the edge of that there. Yep.
Yeah, so this is a luster paper, which is it's sort of in between the matte paper and it still has a bit of sheen to it, a little bit of gloss. But the reason why I like printing on this paper is because often my prints, at least the folks that order my prints, want to put it behind a glass. So in order to protect it, which I understand, but that the glass on a glossy paper is going to prevent the image from being seen. So it's actually like counterintuitive. Whereas this one is able to sort of just keep that bit of matte in it, and it allows the image to be seen. Of course, the placement of your photo is another part of that. But I really like this paper. The detail on it is incredible. So back to the test sheet. So these images I printed a couple times. I try to use the one sheet so that I don't, use up all my paper. But I was able to play with some settings where I played with the dials a bit and understood, okay, I have to compensate a lot more for this color. And once I've done a test sheet like this and I've been able to get those settings right, I create a preset and I apply that preset to that image and I send it out to print with that particular preset. So now I've created a preset specifically for my print settings for a luster paper and for a Pixma 100 Canon printer. There are a lot of variables to take into account here, I know, but that honestly is quite common even for once you send it out to print. That's just going to be the way they approach it also. So it's important just so that you can be able to keep that fine color palette. And yeah, so that's what I like to do. Sometimes the color shows up a bit strange. I've had moments where I increase the saturation a bit too much, like here, and it's really hard to be able to relay this via a digital medium. But if you were to zoom in here and have a magnifying glass or something or other, you'll be able to see it just with the bare eye, honestly, that this color is just far too strong and it doesn't seem realistic. And it's also sort of starts to kind of pixelate because of how much ink had to be dropped in that area. So that's something I don't want to do, for one, because I don't want my ink to be wasted, and two, because I didn't in fact wanted that to be that way. This scene is actually more of a gradient, so I want my printed image to reflect that final process. The same thing happened with this image. I kept losing the purple here, and that was so beautiful about this specific scene. This is a Ocean Drive, that Art Deco historical building, and the sunset that day was this very dramatic sunset, but I'm losing it here because the purple hues weren't saturated enough and they weren't dark, in this case darkened enough. So it's something I had to also compensate because I had clipped out some of the highlights. So playing with that is important on the editing process, but being able to do a test run of this is going to be very helpful, and trying to do it in the same sheet much more economical. I did it again here. I did it again here, but this was playing more on the printer settings. So the printer has different color profiles that you can match up and try to see if it's a good fit. So in this case, I still felt that the neon lights were dying out a bit. So what I did was I picked out the mask brush and actually selectively saturated only the letters and highlighted only the letters. And that is here, the mask brush. I use that often, especially when I want to be able to isolate a specific area or a specific subject. Sometimes I use it stylistically to create fall light conditions, right? Like if my light conditions are kind of blah, I'll use it and create a spotlight and brighten that area. So I hope that was helpful. I know this is sometimes very contingent on your final selection of your printed paper, but that's just part of sort of the workflow, and not just here, but also within the printer, to be able to know which elements work together best. Okay, so let's jump on this image. This was an image I took in Joshua Tree, and as it stands, it's honestly really wonderful. I really love when I get an image that really doesn't require too much editing, or you can just tell that it has so much potential. But it is an image that has a lot of clipping in the dark areas, right? So I wanted to, let me see, I wanted to be able to compensate for that and bring up the shadows. But then I have this kind of issue here where I'm going to start to see this strange thing happen to my blues. And that's the same thing that happened to that image I was just mentioning to you. So this is a good example of showing what that can do. So this is the digital version of that, but that can happen also when there's too much ink on the paper, and it becomes sort of like this blotch that doesn't dry quite right. Because at the end of the day, is an inkjet printer. So inkjet printers go through this process where the heat dries them up. Like whereas the laser printer it's just dust, right? So the inkjet printer, you have to sort of be very, very delicate with the print, let it sort of cool, and you'll see that it changes quite a bit if you really pay attention to some of the areas. So when things like this happen, I honestly sometimes in this situation it's just water, so I don't worry too much that I'm gonna lose the information of the architecture or the skin. So I don't mind that it has that sort of like darker color palette. Okay, so again, with the highlights here seem a little bit extreme, and I want to be able to make that express that ease that I felt that morning, right? Like being able to experience sunrise is back to what we were talking about, storytelling, like being able to edit an image, keeping in mind, because we've been talking so much about technicalities. I think what's really important to also consider while navigating through the editing process is how you edit an image to tell the story of what you experienced, right? Or what you want the viewer to experience. And in this case, if I was to observe this image, I want that sense of ease and calm that I experienced in Joshua Tree that morning to come through. And when I have overblown highlights, that feels a bit like I'm squinting, that doesn't kind of exude that same feeling. So that shows you how far editing can be interpreted or misinterpreted if you don't approach it from the storytelling viewpoint. Let's bring that down a bit. And already you can see some of the other colors coming back. You can see the yellow here coming back. And so I'm gonna make this warmer because I know it's gonna actually err on the cooler side. I'm gonna make sure it gets a bit warmer. I love this image. I think this is the part of the composition where this image is just mirroring itself is just one of my favorite types of composition to create. And then I'm gonna go here to the HSL curve, to the colors, and be able to pick out those blues so that I can give a bit more of that color so that it comes through on the image. So saturation, very important. And if you want that little hint of purple to come through, you see how at the moment you can see it there, but it's just sort of a hint. It'll definitely not be there on the print. You have to exaggerate it. And sometimes that will give some way, and maybe if you're a solution I would consider in situations like this, if I really like that that color, but my camera didn't capture enough of that information, I'm going to grab the brush and set it to, I'm sorry, this brush, and set it to color. You bring this in a little bit, because otherwise, if you bring this dial down, it shows you all of the other settings. We just want to hone in on color. So you can select it like this. You have color, and we can create that purple right here. You can increase it. So I'm increasing it with the brackets, decreasing it and increasing it. And you can just like add a little bit of that purple hint. Right. And you can tell once you've done that, there's a little bit of that hint there, and it just adds a different layer. I think if I was to print this image, the technique that is most intriguing about this photo, the two techniques I think are the color and the contrast. So I don't want to lose that while I'm printing. I don't want to lose the ability of the viewer to experience that ooze and color or that contrast. So I have to be able to make those decisions so that the printer is able to replicate this. So I'm gonna bring up the Hues just a little bit, see what happens here. Yeah, I get a little bit more of that color back also. So all in the effort of bringing back color, right? So we had that image. Now we have this image that's already looking much better. Right. And you can see right now we have a bit of a darker image. So we're going to try to bring up some of those shadows a bit. I think I left them a little bit too dark. Just a little bit. And this in itself, I think if I was to print this photo, I would make it very small and try to just get that patch, because this is the kind of print that takes up a lot of color and a lot of ink. So it's because of all the variations of colors. So try to do your test prints even smaller than the ones that I did. And when I feel happy with I think I just mentioned this, but I didn't show you how I do it. When I feel happy with a setting that I think is going to work, or I've done the test prints and I've seen that it's definitely the one, I create a preset for it. And this acts as my profile, my color profile. And so the way you do that is you can hit Command Copy, and it'll show you the different settings that you want to be able to save. So right here, it's recorded my exposure settings, my contrast, the clippings, the color adjustments. And if you don't want something to be included in that, because maybe you want to customize it based on that particular photo, like lens distortion, all things of that nature sometimes are different depending on what lens you were using on that particular photo, then you can remove that and just copy. And like that allows you to paste it to other images of that particular scenario, right? Or you can actually go here and create a preset of that those settings and those actions that you've done, so that you don't have to redo it, but rather you have a safe setting. So let's say color profile for Joshua Tree. So then I would have that saved under my user presets. And equally, if you need to create color profiles, obviously this is again based on the type of print that you use, but there are resources where you can reach out to your printer and they will allow you to, in fact, they welcome you to send your image, so that they can create a color profile specific to that image, and then you can just apply it. So there's sort of an option there for you, but that can be a lengthy process. So I like to be able to kind of take control and have the ability to do it on my own. So this is the same scenario, and I wanted to show it to you because I took this, as opposed to this, which was during sunrise, I took this midnight, where there was actually little to no light pollution in Joshua Tree. So I was able to really capture some of the stars up here, which was nice. There was a bit of light pollution coming from our some of our neighbors and our buildings there. So that was kind of unfortunate, but it was still good enough that I was able to capture some of those starlights. And so I thought that was very special, continuing that composition, but inviting a new scenery by just waiting for a different time of day. So I'm gonna, let's see, change this to custom so I can play it a little bit with the size. And again, I'm gonna try to even out that horizon. I think a bit more here. Great. So you can see here that we have some distortion happening on the edges, and that's going to be very obvious on a print. So we want to be either have the opportunity to crop that out, or we want to go down here to lens correction and pick the lens that you were using, and that's going to be able to help you correct that error. So that's more of a hardware error, and a lot of our lenses come with those types of issues. So this dialogue section is very important to be able to change that, but also like just keeping aware of what the settings were for that image, because you can also crop them out if you don't remember, or you can't figure out how to do it. You can always just crop out those strange morphing corners. Another way I like to do that in case something looks a little distorted is play around with these sections where like you can mess with the X, Y, and Z axis. And, you know, to some degree, depends on your artistic viewpoint. You can go pretty wild on this, but, you know, you probably don't want to if you're trying to keep it organic and true to what you were trying to document. My work is a bit more on that area, so I wouldn't mess with it too much. But I know if you're doing like self-portraiture and you're doing something where you want to elongate yourself or make yourself look a little bit more dramatic, and it's sometimes those are artistic expressions that can be done through what otherwise seems like a hardware error, and it can actually turn into something very experimental and interesting. So I still have this hint that it looks a bit crooked, so there it is. So I really don't like this thing here. I guess it landed really almost in the center. So I think it distracts from the cleanliness of the rest of the image. So you can use the clone stamp for things like this, and then just find a section to match it. And I'm doing a pretty fast job here, but most times I just take my time and try to find the right section. Make it a little bit bigger. Yeah, so much better. That's when it comes to editing or spot healing. That's also an ethical question I get often. I think that if it serves no purpose and it doesn't accentuate or emphasize your story, or it doesn't tamper with the story, or I mean, taking it away doesn't tamper with the story, then it's fine. This is a little square that meant nothing to the image, but it was in fact distracting from the image. Let's go back to zoomed out. I want to be able to see the stars a bit. Yeah, okay, let's have it this way. Okay. So I do want to be able to see the stars a little bit more. So I know that I want this image to be more contrasted. So I'm going to go in here and bring up the contrast, but that is also applying to the pool. So I'm going to double click it to reset it. Instead, I'm going to isolate the darker areas and try to bring that down. I think that brings it down a little bit better. You can already see more of the stars, and to show them off a bit more, then you bring up the highlights or the whites. And for everything that looks about right, I'm gonna just go a few notches up. Right, so if it looks right here, then I'm gonna just make it slightly brighter to compensate. And this image inherently has that blue and yellow that lends to that cinematic color palette. So I'm gonna try to play with the calibration here and try to see how I can manipulate those colors to see how they blend with each other, right? In this case, you can see how that orange hue is a bit overboard. But if we bring that hue a little bit down, having it saturated might actually work in our favor during the printing process. Let's make the orange. Bring up the luminance. A little less saturated, there you go. And I really like the way the pool kind of turned this interesting color, but I think I still want it to be a bit different. So one of the questions I got with this image was, what is that thing at the bottom? And it was actually a giant pool. But using reflections is such a fun game to just be able to create an interesting composition. Especially when it has to do with subjects that I can't necessarily art direct or tell them to do something or other, or move, or stand closer. It's really about, in situations like this, it's really about my choices, my technical choices in composition, observing color palettes. Sorry, my cat. Observing color palettes.
That's just adding to the show. That's a plus.
Yeah, she's like, it's my turn now.
Yeah.
I'm the expert. Yeah, so it's one of those things where I always have to kind of think, okay, what techniques can I bring to the table? And in situations like architecture or landscape, often the techniques that you learn as a photographer or the post-production that you know that you're going to do later come into play as to how you create that particularly curated image, right? So in this case, I really love the color. I really love this composition. So I had to go back at a different hour. You'll see that I do this commonly. I did it for the vessel also. I think that's really important because I can't do anything about this place. I can't move it. I can't do anything. So I think it's important to wait for different light conditions, bring different hardware, experiment with different techniques, and understand that what I want to express is a color palette, or I want to express a certain mystique of contrast, such as this one. And sometimes it's all very much like decided in that moment, and I just like approach it however I can. And it's very you know, just serendipitous and just go for it. So nonetheless, being able to take account of that while you're editing is going to be able to help you make those decisions of whether you want to bring out those colors, or do you want to be able to like make it more mystique because that's what attracted you about it in the first place. And that's the storytelling through editing. Meanwhile, we also have to consider the technicals part of the printing. So let me know if you have any comments in regards to what type of photography do you like to photograph best? Architecture, things that can be art directed, like models. That's really interesting to me because during this entire journey, I've very much experimented with everything. I found myself doing food photography, lifestyle photography, product photography. And at the end of the day, I always felt so much more alive and so much more excited and thrilled when I was hunting down an image for street photography. And I still really love that. So it's something that I get a lot of questions about often, because especially someone who's starting photography or someone who's been doing a niche for a very long time, and they're wondering if they should do any other area. I'm curious which areas you like to photograph, and if you have a foothold in different areas, such as myself. All right, so this one, I'm going to bring it back to the original, see how we can edit this image. So this image, a little background on this image. This is the classic Art Deco street in Miami Beach. And this is another one that I would love to be able to revisit and try to photograph it at different times when the neon signs are on, or when there's people, when there's no people. There's a lot of different circumstances. As of last year, I was actually last year I was living there. So I had the opportunity to photograph the space while it was beautifully empty and quiet, and just it was such a strange experience to be able to see such a busy street finally get a break from the like, I guess, tourism, and the buildings just were so pronounced and so beautiful. I really love this morning though, because it was right before anything had changed, and I thought the clouds were very dramatic and just very true to the Miami tropical ambience. And you just get these wonderful clouds that just seem like doomsday is coming, but it's actually just gorgeous. So I want to be able to translate that story over, right? Like that's what we're doing here. We're not just editing for the sake of making a photo perfect and crisp and technically like A+, but rather we're maintaining and honoring the story that we want to tell and the experience that we want our viewers to also have. And hopefully they have an experience of their own, right? Because photography, especially when it comes to print or exhibitions, is you're treating them as fine art. And when you experience fine art, you often are asked to have an experience, right? To observe and question, observe and choose and decide your own opinions. And so if you're putting your photograph up in that type of I don't want to call it platform, but almost like a pedestal, right? Like you're asking the same of the viewer to observe with intention, to wonder what else was beyond this story. So I think that's very important, and we shouldn't think of that as sort of like the last thing. It should drive the way you edit your photos.
Gotten a lot of great comments in here, Cyn, in response to your question about what kinds of photography people like. WF Martin likes all photography. That's where I'm at. I'm like, I haven't figured out the thing I like yet. I just take a bunch of pictures. Let's see. Fairy loves shooting nature and model photography. Some other comments in here too. But
yeah, I mean, shooting everything, photographing the things that interest you is very important, because until you photograph everything, you won't really know what is the one that like really holds you and says like, oh my God, this is a space where I find myself being most creative, most involved. And I mean, you see it in other artists, right? We have, if you pay attention to the biographies of famous artists, like we have Van Gogh doing case studies on all forms of arts in order to arrive at his style of art. So it's important to go through that journey of exploring. I absolutely did. I really loved doing food photography. I approached it from that same drama, high contrast, spotlight, cinematic point of view. And it was really cool. It was very intimidating at first, not again, back to, I could probably move things, but it was composition was such a big deal in those situations. And it taught me a lot of what techniques to bring into other spaces and other subject matter. So if I have those same challenges, I know how to approach them. So you learn different things from any discipline. So I would urge you to like definitely be I don't remember his name right now, but like I would urge you to experiment with all. Why not?
There's a comment from Emma who does toy photography, which I'm immediately curious about. That's definitely not something I've explored.
Let's drop the whole live stream. Let's go check that out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, sometimes being indoors, I know, can feel a bit stifling, right? Like, what can I photograph? Why I'm not really presented with things that are just in my face that are clearly photogenic. But I think that is what brings you back to what is the storyline. Maybe you have a space in your home where you can express something brand new, something that almost appears as fiction, right? Where you create a certain spotlight, or you observe that during the day I have this specific section in my house where the window has a spotlight at 5 p.m. and it's beautiful when I see, you know, my cat sitting there, or an item sitting there. Just it becomes right away almost like a studio. And so it's just about observing it from different viewpoints and considering what story you could find there. And also just why not, you know, like we have, if you're playing with film cameras, maybe you have a why not, because you have a certain amount of clicks before you run out of film. But if you have a digital camera, the opportunities are endless. And I think that's something that we don't even realize, right? We can photograph so many images so many times to just get the one. And that is a virtue that we might as well like use up to the max.
Cyn, you mentioned a moment ago that you did some food photography and that you had you brought the same kind of stylistic mindset to your food photography. And that's something I felt like I really noticed looking at the photos on your website. You photograph a broad array of subjects, but I feel like there's a very consistent style. And I was wondering if that's something that you're aware of and think about, and have you worked deliberately to develop a particular look or style for your photography?
I definitely found myself eventually being very consistent in a certain aesthetic, but it wasn't deliberate at first. It was more, I was attracted to the things that were taught to me in graphic design. In school, we had to, in college, we had to understand layout design, right? We had to understand how to compartmentalize information so as to make it digestible and easy to observe and understand. And I would do that with, you know, the streets or neighborhoods I would explore. I would just try to think about in that moment, how can I make this much easier than what I'm experiencing? For example, this image in New York City, like New York City is always hustle and bustle. It's just loud. There's so much going on. And when I'm there, of course, I can just like close my eyes and photograph anything and something will be photogenic. But the idea really for me was, how can I curate a scene that is quieter and it brings you in? And I think that every time I approach it from that point, I end up with images that maybe are similar in style, because they kind of have that same essence. And not deliberate at first, but I have found like common, you know, techniques along them. And sometimes I actually have images that are completely the opposite. Like you will look at them and think, I don't believe she did that, because that's not her aesthetic. In graphic design, being a chameleon is very common. Being able to adapt yourself to a certain brand identity over another is important. So I experimented with a lot. I thought, is my style more minimalistic? Is my style more complex? I experimented with architecture a lot, because I found a lot of comfort in the same shapes that I had been working for over years, right? Like I did brandings and illustrations that were based on vector shapes. And here I was finding them in different ways in buildings. So I think because I saw it from that lens, from that perspective, they started to become series and very, very familiar to each other. But it wasn't on purpose. So like, I think if I can tell my younger self something about that is continue to experiment. Don't try to create a style, but rather eventually you'll find these series that are hidden within like all of the images, because like these images, I didn't say I'm going to create 5 images that go together. I didn't do that. I was in the moment, and I was observing the neighborhood, and I was wondering what makes Chicago Chicago. All the bricks, all the beautiful bricks, and all of the beautiful ways that they create like their aesthetic. And then that's just, I mean, life in a way. But what's amazing about photography is that you become the curator of that noise, and you just create, I guess, in a way, your own melody, right? But you have to curate it. You have to curate it through photographic techniques, through your post processing. You have to be intentional with it. And I know it's hard to hear you have to, but I genuinely think that if you're approach it from that point of view, you're not going to just get a happy, surprising result where you get an image that is kind of cool, but you don't understand why. I used to be that way. I used to be like, I know this image is good, but I have no idea what I did right. Those happy accidents are neat, you know, but what if you could do that consistently? I think that really was separates you from being a photographer that can deliver, not just for clients or things where they're, you know, you are, I guess, asked to do a specific brief, but also deliver for yourself, and I guess the expectations that you have for yourself as an artist. This is another series that I have where I explored strangers in the United States. I named it We the Peoples, where I was questioning, or I was asking myself the question, who is We the Peoples of the United States? And this was this was a journey that I took on. Mostly it's inspired by my own experience as an immigrant, but now it's more relevant than ever. And it is really interesting that assigning yourself projects can down the road become something even bigger. I mean, this was before we were undergoing so many questions and so many powerful individuals that are just like really making such change today, right? Like I'm just so like proud of the bold statements that artists and people are making today that I think before were just but whispers, right? And I think this was my way of expressing that. So to experiment, like I found myself in every nook. Photographing people, photographing architecture, and yet approaching it from a storytelling point of view, I think kind of tied all that together at the end of the day.
Awesome. Cyn, I'm going to give you just a heads up here. We have about 8 minutes left here today.
Okay, gotcha. So let's see what we can do with 8 minutes. This is a good challenge for the speedy workflow with our shortcuts, right?
Leave me 2 minutes at the end for a sign off.
Okay.
Okay. You're down to 6 minutes.
Okay, so remember, we have the O in case we want to change that composition. And I'm going to make this, I know that I want to make this maybe a 16:9 because it just has that horizontal grandness about it. And we're going to really accentuate those clouds, because that is what I really loved about that image. And so I can see that the clouds had a little bit of that orange hint, or yellow, I guess orange and pink hint. So let's see how we keep those. I want those to really show up on my print. So we're going to saturate them quite a bit. Let's see there. And again, this is what an extreme post-process photo might look like, but it will be dialed down in the final result. Let's bring those blacks up so we can see some of that sand. And bring up those highlights and press J so we are not clipping. And already it's much better. We're gonna make it warmer because it's sunny city. We do not want this to look like a cool day. And finally, I'm gonna actually paint a bit on my shadows. I'm gonna make them a little bit warmer. just a little bit. Really make it feel like the heat is on. And bring up that brightness a bit more because we're compensating. And the shadows a little bit down, so it still has a little bit of drama. And there you go. So we've changed that image.
That was 2 minutes. Do you want to do another 3 photos? That was a super speed.
So that's, yeah, I mean, that's what's so cool about it, because then at this point, all I have to do is be organized, right? So I love using shortcuts like the number dialogues, like the 5, to be able to say, okay, this is my selected photo. You can also paint that image a different color, so that if you're working with a client, then you're able to, you know, sort of decide together which one is the one that you like. I sometimes tend to do this while I'm curating the photos to bringing them to edit, but also afterwards, once I've done the editing, something as small as the different light conditions can really change which one I choose at the end to move forward with. So being able to have that organization is one of the reasons why I like Lightroom Classic so much, because I have that ability to sort of find all of my files, because after a while, you really do end up with a lot of choices to make, and having that organization lets me know which prints are ready and which images you know, I have the safekeeping of not wasting ink on, and have like the ability to move forward with my prints.
Awesome. We're getting some nice comments here from Emma, or maybe it's Ema. I always have to give my blanket apology for my mispronunciation of people's names.
Yeah.
Thanking you for the great stream, also from WF Martin. So yeah, really, and let me add my thanks to this. This has been really fantastic. So Cyn and I will be back tomorrow, and if I've got this right, Cyn, tomorrow we are actually going to get into the print module in Lightroom Classic. Is that correct?
Yes. So tomorrow we're going to get into more of the technical specs of the print module, and we'll be printing some of our images.
Fantastic. And let me just say a couple of housekeeping items here. So that pregnant pause that I had just there was this like godlike voice speaking to me in my head, telling me that the next show after ours has been canceled for today. So I'm not going to introduce that show like I was about to. I will say that if you missed the last Photoshop Daily Creative Challenge, you can always catch the replays of those every weekday at 9 a.m. Pacific. And of course, I will say that Cyn and I will be back tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Pacific for part 2 of this series. And tomorrow will also include our Artist Spotlight feature, where we'll take a look at another artist's work on Behance tomorrow. So that is, I think, wraps it up for us today here. Cyn, thank you so much. This has been really fantastic. And I can't wait to see what you have for us again tomorrow. And to everyone in the audience, thank you guys so much for joining us.